What impact will the Venezuela news have on the markets this week? We go through all that and more in this week's Sunday Scan. I'm Chris with Investors Underground, and every single week we go through the most in-place stocks and news to basically translate into actionable trades, and we get that all prepared for you to save you time so that you have a much better chance of being successful in the week ahead. Over the weekend, we had massive news that the US basically went into Venezuela and they're doing a regime change. Now, we're interested in this from a market perspective and what sectors and what stocks could potentially be moving off of it. We're going to get into all that, and more importantly, not just the specific stocks to watch, but a process for finding which stocks to go to when the market actually opens, because we might have a broad list of stocks that we're generally interested in off of the news, but we'll go through the process of how to narrow that down into actionable trades throughout the week. So before I get into all this, I'll give the disclaimer now that I'm not a financial advisor and these are not buy or sell recommendations. Everything I'm going to go through is for educational and informational purposes only. Now let's get into Sunday Scan for the week ahead. Make sure that you like, share, and subscribe to stay up to date with the latest developments with Investors Underground and with the markets in general. So before we get into any chart share for this week, what I really want to go over is the definition of a catalyst and how that applies to us as traders and how it applies to in-place stocks. So if you were to look at the root word of what a catalyst actually means, it means to dissolve. And so in the market context, what we're doing is dissolving price stability. So if you have stocks or asset classes or sectors that are generally within an equilibrium point, which just means that buyers and sellers kind of agree on the general price, what happens is that when a catalyst comes along, that is disrupting or dissolving that price stability. And then that's how revaluations happen. And that's how volatility happens. And so when you have a large piece of macroeconomic news like the Venezuela situation, what tends to happen is that you have anything that could potentially be connected to that, either directly or indirectly, it gets price reevaluation. And that means that increased volume comes in, increased volatility comes in, and that makes it in play for us as traders. And as traders, the most important thing is that we're playing the right kinds of stocks. And we want things that have that volatility. We want things that have that liquidity. And in order to do that, we need things that are usually tied to either catalysts directly or things that are indirectly tied to catalysts through secondary knock-on effects. So in the context of the Venezuela situation, we have a couple of things that are kind of being repriced right now. Now, one of them is going to be the commodities markets. Obviously, there's big impacts for the oil market, for critical minerals, and a lot of other things based on this news. And so what happens is that we tend to look for sectors that could potentially be impacted by this news. And then what we do is we build a watch list. And then we're watching to see which of these names and which of these sectors actually gets volume and liquidity and volatility when the market opens. We might have a general idea of what to watch, but it's not until we get those confirmation signs of price action and volatility and volume increase that we kind of get an idea of where the market is really placing its importance and its money. And so we might have 3 or 5 sectors on watch and maybe 5 or 10 or 15 stocks on watch. And that is a good way to start and to be familiar with the potential stocks and the setups that could be in play. But it's not until the market opens and we maybe get futures opening on Sunday night, and we get some overnight market action on different apps and things like that that offer that. And then obviously in the pre-market, we'll get a much better sense for what are the most in play things. And so you basically have a catalyst. You have sectors that are on watch, and then as time goes on and as we get into the market open on Monday, that is when we can really dial in and focus on what are the stocks that we want to trade that day related to this possible news. And so given that kind of template or framework, there's a couple other things to think about. Really, any kind of price movement is going to be based on supply and demand. And so when catalysts come along, we really want to analyze what is really happening. Is there a supply shock coming on, or is there a demand shock coming on? So take the price for oil, for example. If we have some sharp, volatile moves on the overnight session, with futures on Sunday night and then into Monday, we could have, significant moves either up or down with oil. But really, we just know that oil will be in play. And that's the thing to focus on. Then we let the market show us really what direction and what things are they prioritizing, because you could have different kinds of narratives take hold. You could have, now the U.S. has a lot more access to oil reserves. So that could potentially be a big supply, glut coming on to the market over the next couple of years. So maybe oil could go down on that. or maybe the market's saying, well, that's not going to happen for a while. But in the meantime, all these oil companies are going to be investing in infrastructure and things like that. And so that could spike some oil infrastructure ETFs. And so that's where the volume could go. Or we could say that maybe the U.S. controls a lot of this oil now, and so the U.S. Economy and U.S. Denominated commodities are going to be surging on that for a little while until this supply actually comes on the market. So there's a lot of different narratives that can take hold, but really the thing to focus on is there a large catalyst that can affect sectors? Yes. And then if so, have plans or be open-minded to either scenario. So just because I think that oil might do one thing or the other, what I really want to do is just have it on watch and then to watch the price action and see how the market forms that narrative, because there's going to be investment research funds and there's going to be large institutional players that are kind of setting the prices and setting that price action. And what I want to do is try to identify what is happening in the broad economy, identify how the big players are responding to that, and then see if there's a trading setup specifically that I can play. So either is there a wave of demand coming into a sector, new money coming in, new volume, new volatility? And if so, is there a way to play that on the long side? Is there a way to participate, as a trend forms, maybe dips along that trend to capitalize on the upside? And then I choose my instrument, either equity or options, or if someone's a futures trader, they can do something like that. And that's kind of similar to what we were talking about last week with the big silver trade that happened. We knew that there was going to be we thought very strongly that there was going to be a big mean reversion trade coming. And so we were preparing for that. And then you basically go through, okay, what are the potential ways that this could unfold? Someone, a futures trader, so they can capitalize on that, on opening night, on Sunday night when the futures kind of gapped up and then the mean reversion trade started to take place. Or is someone more of an equity trader, or are they more of an options trader? And so everyone's specific strategy based around these setups is going to determine, how they kind of go about that individually. So back to the Venezuela thing, back to, the sectors that could be in play. We know that we have a big catalyst. We know that there could be multiple narratives forming, but what we really want to do is have a broad list of stocks that could potentially be moving and then narrow that down into the market open based on what is getting the most volume, what is getting the most price action in a certain direction, and what is getting the most attention. And that is where all the traders will basically hang out, both the big institutional ones and the small traders. And that's where things will become in play. And that's where we want to focus. So the goal of Scan tonight is to kind of give you a template for viewing the market in that way. And then we'll list a bunch of stocks that will be on watch to kind of get ourselves familiar with it. And then as the market opens, in futures around the time that this video is released, and then also into Monday morning, that is when we will really have a better sense of what is going to be the most in play. And then on the supply demand front, is there a new wave of demand coming in, or is there going to be a new wave of supply, and how could that potentially impact the sector? So I just kind of want to lay that groundwork beforehand. And I think that that'll be very applicable and helpful to people, not just for a macro shock like this, but also for, any kind of industry or sector catalyst. When something significant happens that spills over into the markets, and as traders, what our job is to try to find the most in-play things based on those signals. And then we zone in to see what are our setups. Are we either trying to participate in a newly forming trend, or is that trend getting overextended and is it getting ready for a mean reversion, or is it getting ready for a full reversal and to play a counter trend if the supply dynamics and the demand dynamics flip on that? And then there's just so many ways to go about it. So really understanding what could be in play and then applying our specific setups that have edge to that. And by edge, I just mean that we want something where we have a repeatable pattern. So for instance, with the silver mean reversion trade, it's not so much that, we knew the exact price or anything like that it was going to happen at. We just knew that the pattern of something getting very overextended, it becomes much more vulnerable to a big flush, a big mean reversion, as longs get a higher average, as there's more leverage introduced into the asset class. And that is a recipe and a pattern that basically makes it vulnerable to a big mean reversion trade. So that's how we were able to capitalize on some of those trades last week in Investors Underground. It's by really understanding the supply and demand dynamics of these setups, and then applying our own specific criteria and our own patterns and edge into that. And that's really what we do in Investors Underground. So let's get into some charts now, and we will go over some things to keep on watch for the week ahead. So the first thing is going to be oil. So USO could be a proxy for that. If some people are watching futures on crude oil or anything like that, that is also fine. But you really want to have some kind of measure for what is oil doing over the coming days. And so you could either have significant moves to the upside or to the downside, depending on how the market interprets everything. But what I know for sure is that oil will likely be very volatile on Monday and into the week ahead. So that is one way to kind of play this news, is to watch for the reaction in oil, watch for the volume in oil, and then to see, what are the knock-on effects of that. So, for instance, you could have something like OIH, which is the oil services ETF. So, if the market is betting on increased kind of infrastructure coming to Venezuela, coming for the oil trade, then that could be one way that you have a wave of demand coming into something like OIH. And then you're basically saying, okay, are there technical patterns that I can use to play that? So, this has been in an uptrend for a while now, coming into some resistance, but we have a new catalyst. And so, with catalyst, you're more likely to break through resistance. And so, that could be a nice long setup, either with equity or with options. And then getting into more specific tickers, you could have something like CVX, Chevron, which is basically has exposure to Venezuela, and they are going to be possibly a big benefactor of that. And so this has been in a nice uptrend and then a big consolidation. And so what tends to happen is that if you have a positive catalyst that could positively impact a stock like this, you can have a wave of demand come in. And so if you had that wave of demand come in and it starts to break out of a long-term base, you can get some really nice breakouts to the upside there. And then the same thing goes for things like XOM and COP as well. And then these are a couple of other names basically in the oil sector that could be potentially benefited from something like the Venezuelan news happening. You can also go the ETF route. So just like with OIH, betting on the services ETF, you could also have, instead of trying to play specific oil companies or oil names, you could have things like XLE, which just makes the process a little bit easier. You don't get usually as volatile of moves, but you can get a little bit more certainty, and it can kind of be a catch-all for some of those moves in there. So that is also one to keep on watch. Then you have kind of special situation setups in specific stocks. So again, I have a couple of these pulled up, and we don't really know what's going to be in play until Monday, but there's a few things like, again, other energy infrastructure ETFs. But then you have things like PBR. So basically, even though it's not necessarily in Venezuela, you have kind of South American oil exposure with some of the big companies down there. So those could be impacted either positively or negatively, depending on how the market interprets it. And so that means that, okay, if they're saying that maybe oil production increases in that region, maybe the US gets more dominance, maybe then some competitors are not as competitive anymore. And so maybe that could hit them. Or if it's seen as, okay, maybe they'll slide into some of that market share, then that could benefit them. So either way, I think PBR will be in play on Monday. There's a couple other ones like HAL, and then some of these other ones. So like, for instance, this RML and GDRZF. So some of these are very tiny. These are almost like OTC style, but some of these have historical ties to Venezuela, and some of them had their assets confiscated, or some of them have, ties to basically mining rights there. And so those could potentially be like special situations as the market unfolds and uncovers all this news, and we'll be able to see with the volume and with the price action what is in play for that. So basically, it's a long way of saying that you'll likely have some small caps also start to cash in on some of this catalyst. And so that could mean that you have different sectors in play, like critical minerals. You could have anything tied to South America moving. You could have things with historical Venezuelan ties. And then you could have some other things like gold that tends to rise when there are geopolitical tensions, because you have to think about it. There's not just, an isolated incident with Venezuela, but Venezuela was really a hotspot for several, of the big economies to kind of, they were pretty active there. You had things with China, you had things with Iran, you had things with Russia. And so you basically have some big players operating in this portion of the country. And so now that that is disrupted, you could have that spill into those different countries in some different form. And so, for instance, you could have things with China. If China, looks upon this negatively and they respond, sharply, that could spill into some Chinese equities. And if you have a setup on something like Baidu, which has been, running huge on some AI news, and they're going to do essentially a spin out of one of their companies, but you've had this on a tear and it's coming up into some resistance. And so what could potentially happen on Monday is that maybe you have a gap down, or maybe you have a gap up, but you could run some trouble here. And so that could basically set up for maybe a short trade or maybe some put trades as you have something that's gotten overextended on some news, and then you kind of have a counter trend revelation happening if you have China respond negatively to the U.S., and then maybe that could, reinvigorate some of the rare earth or the critical mineral supply chain issues, because Venezuela also has access to a good amount of rare earths and critical minerals. So that could kind of play into that too. And we have stocks like UU, and some other ones that are basically connected to that. So you have MP, you have CRML, you have some other things that have been in play recently, especially as the new year starts, that could be reinvigorated from that. So when I'm looking for sectors that could potentially be impacted, I'm looking for things that have had historical narratives. So like sector trades, like rare earths, like uranium, like oil, and some of the associated moves with that. So really this week, it's more just about laying that framework and then, giving exposure to a broad list of stocks, but we're not going to get too biased into what trade setups are going to form, because we really don't know how the market's going to interpret a lot of this news until Monday. And so I'm just getting prepared with the names that I have on watch. And then I want to have correlated names to the Venezuela situation. And then I want to have uncorrelated names that could be, different setups. So something that falls into that category is like a CVNA. And so CVNA was on watch for the last, month or so after the index ad. And we were talking about the supply demand imbalance here. And then you basically had some failed follow through. And then after the index ad and after that, we thought that a lot of demand would basically drop off. And then as you have the new year start, that is a time when people can take profits on some of the biggest winners from 2025. And so that can cause large mean reversion moves. And we had a nice drop from about 500 or 480s at the peak to now around 400, and that could potentially continue as it goes down. But this has already come in a decent amount, so something to be aware of. You also have some other names like MU. This has been on watch recently. This kind of had an episodic pivot with their last earnings report, and basically, if earnings were up a hugely significant amount in the memory space in the AI trade, then that is a signal that you can have something get revalued to the upside, and so that just means a bunch of demand comes in as those big institutional players are revaluing something like Micron. So that's a name that is still on watch for upside until it gets grossly overextended, and then it will go on watch for a mean reversion for a trader like me, who I like to participate in trends when they're on the path of least resistance. So I want to go with the trend while it's still in play. And then as it gets overextended, that's when you tend to take profits. And then as it gets really overextended, that's when you flip your bias for a more of a mean reversion trade back to a longer time trend. And so a couple other things that could be on watch. We have some names in the drone space. So I won't get into specific tickers because, again, we'll just be on watch for those on Monday. And so basically, we want to be on watch for oil and oil sector trades. We want to be on watch for anything South American related. We have things from China that will be on watch for some potential mean reversion if there's knock-on effects there. And then we also want to have defense names on watch in case any countries respond aggressively with rhetoric. And then we also want to have things like the drone space, critical minerals, and anything like that kind of in place. So that is kind of laying the template and the framework for this week. And then we'll basically get a lot more information on Monday as those themes and those trends kind of take hold. So what I'll be watching for is what names and sectors are getting the most attention, what's getting the most volume, and then what's getting the most price action. And then I'm trying to think about, okay, is this a new trend forming? Is there demand coming into this? Is this a trend that's already been in play that is maybe getting overextended, possibly with a counter trend catalyst like Baidu, which will be on watch for a mean reversion trade? And then, are you looking for a sector reversal? And so you could have something in a number of spaces that are getting reversals, almost like the CVNA trade, which had a huge layer of demand into the index ad. And then basically as it mean reverted, now the beginning of the year, there's a lot of profit taking and something like that. And also names like APP as well, which are all coming in after those catalysts. So that's really what I want to go over on Scan this week. I hope that it was helpful to you. Sometimes there's really a lot of names to go on with very specific trade plans. And other times it's better to just be familiar with the broad template and what to look for. And then as people get kind of a read on that, then in places like Investors Underground, that's where we're giving live commentary to, this is how I'm trading this. This is my thesis on it. These are the levels that I'm watching. This is the price action I want to see. This is my entry. And then this is around my exit. And that's really what our community is all about. So if you're interested in that, We always leave a link in the comment section to join IU. So I hope that you check that out. It's a great way to start 2026. And then, just getting a better read on some different sectors like the silver trade that we had, which was fantastic. That is not, all original stuff. That is coming from people like Phil Gettiker and people who have done, their courses on the Legends playbook for parabolic mean reversion trades. And they really lay out all the criteria so that people can get very accurate reads and very, substantial trades when those moves play out. So hopefully that was great, information for you to think about and to apply for your trading into the week ahead. Again, like, share, subscribe, and I hope that you check out Investors Underground, and we will see you in the room this week. Take care.